to Wednesdays with the Mayor. I'm Dennis Bragg. We're here in the meeting rooms in the Missoula Public Library up on the 4th floor, and it's time to sit down with Mayor Jordan Hess, which we like to do every month, but we have a lot of guests with us tonight because we're dealing with a big topic, and so there's a lot of moving parts. To Jordan's left right there, we have County Commissioner Josh Slotnick. Josh, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it. We also have our state representative from the legislature, Mark Thane, is with us. Mark, thank you very much. And then two of our very key administrative staffers, both chief administrative officers. We have Chris Lonsbury with the county, Missoula County, and then, of course, Dale Bickle with the city of Missoula. So we're going to talk property taxes tonight. I'm excited about this because it's really a follow-up to a conversation I think was probably February, I think. We were right in the middle of the legislative session. And we talked about the need for property tax reform and those kinds of things. And of course, some things happened, some didn't, a lot didn't perhaps, and now we're hearing the bills are arriving. And so a lot of people have been concerned about that. Mayor, let's talk a little bit at first about what you've been hearing when it comes to the property tax issue right now.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the folks that are streaming online. Appreciate everyone joining us. I think the thing for me is that fundamentally property taxes are too high, and our property tax system is broken. And that's something that that we hear over and over again in local government. And I think in advance of the next legislative session, it's important that we start talking about property taxes more directly and more openly with the public to really raise awareness to what is, in my mind, a system that's broken in the state of Montana. Our property tax system is based on an economy that just doesn't exist anymore. It was based on decades ago we had multiple mills in the valley running multiple shifts a day. We had low residential property values. We had very few tourists. And today, that's turned on its head. Our economy is largely transformed. We have a huge tourism economy. We have really high property values, and we don't have that industrial tax base that we used to have. And our property tax system is still based on that economy that hasn't existed for decades, really. On top of that, the legislature, in times of high growth in the past, has adjusted downward the tax rate for residential properties. And they didn't do that this year. And so as residential property values are going up, residences are carrying more of the tax burden, and the industry, the Northwestern Energies and the large utilities, the other classes of property are paying a proportionally lower share than they have historically. So it is a case of rising values and rising taxes for residences and a shift of tax burden from commercial properties or from industrial properties really to residences. On top of that, property taxes are not connected to ability to pay. So we have a lot of people in Missoula who have owned their home, who have lived in their home for multiple decades, and maybe they're on a fixed income, maybe their home is paid off, and their property taxes continue to go up as their value goes up, but they are not, it's not connected to the ability to pay, like income taxes where, it's a portion of your income. So you can pay a portion, and as your income increases, the portion increases. So there's a lot of factors at play here, and it's an issue of community concern, and it's something that we need to continue to talk about.
I want to switch over, and we'll do a couple of opening comments here to just sort of set the stage. Commissioner Josh Slotnick is here. Josh, I know you echo a lot of what the mayor has talked about. From the county's perspective, a little bit different slice of things, but a lot of similarities, right, in dealing with the problem.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Dennis. So I definitely echo pretty much everything my friend Mayor Hess just said. One thing I want to add, you mentioned our conversation in February. A big thing that's changed since February is everybody out there who owns a home received a letter from the Department of Revenue, a pretty alarming letter, and it's something I want to address if I can in these opening comments. That letter, if you look across, it has a row of numbers, and on the first chunk, the first big box there, says this is your new assessed value. So the state Department of Revenue, not the legislature, but the Department of Revenue, used a computer program, CAMA, the Computer Assisted Mass Appraisal, to appraise the value of your house. And they're attempting to approximate market value. So that's kind of fact. That just is. You skip over a couple. The next one is tax rate. And Jordan mentioned this. And this is a really important thing. Across our county, across every county, there are a whole bunch of different types of real estate categorized by the state and by the Department of Revenue. There's commercial, retail, industrial, residential, but I'm going to focus on residential. That residential tax rate, unlike market value of your house, is not fact, it's not indisputable, it's actually changeable. The state legislature had an opportunity to adjust that tax rate. It can go up or down. They get to make that decision. Historically, when home values, or those assessed values, have gone way up, the state has turned down the dial on those tax rates. As Jordan said, they chose not to do that this time. So then the next big number, if we're going from left to right, says the amount of mills the county or the city assessed last time. And a mill is a unit of taxation. So that number of mills, that's the amount of taxes that the city or county asked from our taxpayers. And then the next number over is your expected tax liability. Well, that number of mills, they used last year's number of mills. And why I'm bringing this up is because the state has instituted for decades, I think it was in the 80s, these guys might be able to correct me, a mill cap. The city and the county literally can't go beyond a certain number. Basically, we can't add more than half the level of inflation to what we did last year. And there's some things that are outside of that mill cap, basically things have been voted on one way or another. So that letter from the DOR said, if we use last year's mills and this year's super high home value, your expected tax liability is going to be spectacularly high. A piece of that is not accurate, and it's our piece, the city and the county, because we're under a cap. Now, I'm stressing this our piece because if you write a check to Missoula County, all those taxes aren't going into Missoula County's coffers. By statute, we collect taxes for the city. We also collect taxes for the school district. I pointed at Mark because he used to run the school district here. We also collect taxes for a bunch of special districts, things like special districts that are created around specific needs around road maintenance or sewer and water, and for rural fire and a handful of other things. The county collects all those taxes, but we only keep the piece that's ours. And of the piece that we keep, a bunch of it is voted on, it gets down to a little more than 20% that we actually get to make choices on. And the last thing I want to say, on those choices, we don't look at our potential for taxation. Oh, we're just going to maximize what we can do and then we'll figure out what to do with the money. I could see why a person might think that when you look at this Department of Revenue letter. Well, this is what your house is worth. This is how much money they're going to take. It's not that way at all. We start with our budget. We work with our departments and we figure out what's it going to take dollar-wise for us to run an efficient county government next year without really hurting people and remaining underneath that mill cap, which is a law. We figure out what that number is, and then we adjust our taxation accordingly. It's the budget that matters more so than those numbers on the DOR sheet. And the DOR isn't nefarious or greedy or evil or anything. They're following statute. But it is misleading, and this year pretty scary, and I think all this I wanted to make sure and say out loud.
I want to ask you one clarification on that,
Please.
Josh. So when we talk about the mill rate, and so last year,
right,
we're talking about this assessment that the state has, the number. How does that inequity hurt us? Would it have been better if it had been based on a more current number or going back, or how could that have been a little more in balance than you're seeing?
The piece of it that I believe was a problem associated with this letter is that it was really frightening to people, and unnecessarily so. Also, this is, I almost said crap there. This stuff is so complicated, and it can't be explained in a couple sentences on a sheet. And again, the DOR did what by statute they're asked to do, and we have a cap on the mills that we can use. And this year, the value of a mill is much higher than in previous years because of that increase in home value and the state's failure to adjust residential tax rate. So I would have liked it if instead of saying, well, this is the mills they did last year, and if they did that, this is going to be your new tax rate, your new tax liability. If somewhere in there, they might have skipped that or have noted there's a mill cap. Some way to tell people that this thing that they've outlined is not an actual eventuality. This isn't absolutely going to happen. It scared people unnecessarily. And again, it's so complicated. I'm sure if anybody's remaining awake before we get to Mr. Thane, you'll see what I mean. It's hard to get this information across in just a few sentences.
Good. Okay, well, we'll come back to that. I want to switch over to Mark Thien to kind of look at it from the Helena perspective, but also from the Missoula perspective. Mark, what are some of the things you're hearing as these tax letters have dropped, and what's kind of your look at how this has been shaping up?
So first of all, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, everyone, for attending. I have the pleasure of serving as the vice chair of the Interim Revenue Committee. So we're in the middle of this discussion, and one of the responsibilities of our committee is actual oversight of the Department of Revenue. So we have initiated some conversation about how the appraisal notices go out and whether or not there should be some change in statute, because as was referenced previously, it unnecessarily creates concern. I would suggest that taxes will go up. We all probably believe that, but not anywhere near the magnitude of tax increase that was referenced on the appraisal forms. As Commissioner Slotnick referenced, because the value of the mill has increased dramatically, what will happen is the cities, the counties, and the school districts will set their budgets. They're limited to half the rate of inflation for that increase. Then after they've set their budgets, they'll determine how many mills need to be levied in order to generate that amount of revenue. So they will levy fewer mills in all likelihood than they levied in 2022. Yet your tax appraisal notice used that 2022 mill number to estimate what you would pay in 2023. So it's likely a large overstatement. There are 101 mills that are collected at the state level. 6 are voted on every 10 years. They support the Montana University system. And then 95 mills support school equalization across the state. And that gets a little complex also, but essentially what it does is it generates state level revenue because some school districts don't have the tax base to generate the kind of revenue they need to support their budgets. So there's an equalization process where money flows to those districts that can generate fewer tax dollars. You might not suspect it, but Missoula benefits typically from some of that equalization money also. So as was referenced, the 101 mills will experience a bit of a windfall this year. But if you look at your overall tax bill, and I looked at mine this week, I reside here in the city of Missoula, and last year 901.4 mills were levied against my property. So when you consider the 95 mills at the statewide level or the 101 mills, that's less than 10% of what I pay typically in my taxes when you start adding on the fees and everything else. So yes, there is a bit of a windfall, but it's not going to be tremendously significant in terms of the overall tax bill. The legislature recognized that was going to be a problem, and there could have been 2 different approaches. One was to adjust the rate, and the last time that was done was back in 2006, I believe. Back then, we were on a 6-year appraisal cycle. So imagine if we waited 6 years to do a new appraisal, what might happen to the appraised value of your home. So in order to kind of slowly impact the taxpayers, there was a phase-in of those appraised values, and oftentimes the tax rate was changed. Now your property's reappraised every 2 years, so it should stay more current. You might have questions about whether or not your appraisal is accurate. We've heard a lot of those questions. The Department of Revenue has done a study, and about 90% of the homes that were sold within 6 months of their appraisal sold within a very small margin of error, about 97% of the appraised value. So again, those appraisal amounts seem to be fairly accurate. The final thing I'll say is that there were a number of tax bills that came through our committee. I was on House Taxation. We had 136 bill hearings during the session. We actually passed 66 tax-related bills, many of them property tax-related. We didn't get the big property tax relief that we wanted, and there are a variety of reasons for that we could discuss later. There is property tax rebate coming, $1,350 spread out over 2 years. You know, I look at that as kind of a stopgap. It'll help deal with the increase that you'll experience during the biennium, but we really need to come around to figuring out a way to get some long-term property tax relief. There are some property tax circuit breakers, and we did some work, although a couple of the initiatives we proposed were not successful. But if you are elderly homeowner, there's an elderly homeowner's tax credit, and it essentially gives you a credit based on your income against the assessed value of your home so that your property taxes are reduced. And then there's the PTAP, which is the Property Tax Assistance Program. For those people that have income of $45,000 or less, they can get a reduction on their property taxes. We worked hard to try and liberalize those higher income figures and maybe more generous payouts, but we're looking at about $1,150 per qualified household on the Property Tax Assistance Program, which again, will make a bit of a difference. So I think the concern that we've heard is well placed. There need to be long-term solutions, and that's one of the failures, I think, of the legislature. One of the other things that was done, and I think if you try and rationalize it a little bit, people don't complain too much about income tax because it comes out of their paycheck routinely. A lot of people who are paying mortgages pay through an escrow account in order to pay their property taxes, so they don't notice that big hit. But once your house is paid off and you're paying your taxes in November and May, it's a huge hit. So one of the changes that we made is you can now make those property tax payments in 7 equal payments from November through May. The goal is to move it to a 12 equal payment system so that it's not such a large bite at one time. Again, that doesn't effectively reduce your taxes, but it does help people to budget differently.
That's really good. And we're going to come back to the budget piece, but to set that up, I want to talk to both of you a little bit. And thank you, Mark. I want to talk to both of you a little bit about this fiscal responsibility and kind of this stewardship piece. And let's pass to Jordan for a second. Mayor, so when you hear these kinds of concerns, and like we talked about, a few months back, knowing that a lot of this was coming down the pike, how is that informing the decisions that are made? How is it informing your budget process for the city?
Well, our budget process, and Commissioner Slotnick alluded to this, is really driven by that mill cap. That's the barrier that we're up against. So the legislature in the 1980s limited the growth of general fund taxes for local governments at half the rate of inflation. We have seen costs increase in many cases at a rate greater than inflation. Emulsified asphalt increased 72% in the last 5 years. Our calls for service in the fire department increased 50% in the past 5 years. We've had costs that increase at a rate different than the cost of milk and bread and cars and the consumer price index. And so our limitation is really that mill levy cap, and that's always where we're coming from. We're budgeting from a point of scarcity. So there has never been as much wealth or prosperity in the state history, and you see that through the income tax collections at the state level. There's a $2.5 billion surplus at the state level this session, and local governments around the state are struggling to really complete basic functions, to replace police cars, to give meaningful raises to employees, to handle deferred maintenance in their park systems. These are problems that are common across local governments around the state. And I just say that to set the context so at the same time residential property taxes are growing and rising, it's reasonable to ask why are local governments having these revenue problems? And really the reason for it is that tax shift. So the pie isn't growing, it's just the share of the pie that's going to or that's being attributed to residential payers is greater. So back in '99, I think it was about 40% of Missoula's county tax base was residential, and in 2000, in this decade, it's about 60%. So that shift is happening, and it's happening quickly and happening dramatically. So from a budgeting standpoint, we really look at our needs. We prioritize things that are required or urgent, and we do our best to fund the services that residents ask for. I have never encountered residents asking for fewer services. No one wants us to cut the grass in the parks less. No one wants us to take another 40 seconds on a fire department response. And you see that you see that time and time again, particularly in Missoula and in facilities like this, where the taxpayers and the voters generally in Missoula ask for services that they believe they get a good value out of. Things like this library. The voters approved this almost a 60-40 basis. And that demonstrates that they want the library and that they see value in it and want to pay for it. So it's a balance. You know, we need to provide the services that that residents expect and ask for, and we need to do everything we can to work within this property tax system. I think the long term, and I'll just continue to hammer this, I think the only long-term solution for funding local government in the state of Montana is comprehensive tax reform.
Now, I want to ask this, and then I'll have Josh respond as well to this question, though, because as a resident, a property owner, a taxpayer, I sit there and look, well, the cap is actually a pretty good deal because, you know, someone would argue that if that cap is not there, my taxes are going to go up even more. You know, explain a little bit why that cap is important, but doesn't there need to be some checks and balances, though, from that standpoint?
Yeah, well, frankly, I think that the checks and balances are the voters, in my opinion. I think that that's the appropriate system. I think what we have is a problem where we don't have a diversification of revenue sources. So the Legislative Interim Committee a couple of years ago looked at what the revenues were for local governments in Montana versus other states. And local government general fund tax revenue in Montana is 96.5% property tax driven. When you look at other states, it's around 70%. And they have they have things like local option sales taxes or tourist taxes. They have in some cases local option income taxes or other types of taxes to diversify the tax base. And I think that is really a part of the solution, is that we have to look to other forms of revenue. The cap is it's arbitrary, and it's not. It doesn't accomplish its intended purpose. It throttles the ability of local governments to provide the services they need. It doesn't. What we need is flexibility. We need other sources in order to reduce property taxes.
Josh, could you comment on that?
Yeah, thanks. First, I want to do the mill cap.
Yeah.
Okay. So the mill cap is half the 3-year average of inflation. Just to wrap your minds around that, half the 3-year average of inflation. The activity that all of the four of us are involved in are literally providing services. In order to provide those services, we have to pay people and we have to buy gear. In both those markets, we are subject to the full rate of inflation, not half the rate of inflation. I've said this before, hopefully it's not too tiresome yet. We have 60 deputies out driving around in cruisers in shifts. We burn through a lot of tires. Could you imagine us going into Les Schwab and say, we need 2,400 tires every 6 months, and I'd like to buy those tires at half the rate of inflation? You'd be laughed at. But that's what we do. The only way we make it is through new growth. When we get new houses and new commercial construction, that's outside of the mill cap. We are literally in a grow or die situation. If we don't grow, we are at half the rate of inflation, and every year we would reduce the amount of folks who work for us and not replace the amount of gear they have to access to do their jobs. And to add to the kind of pinch of this, not only is it grow or die, the growth does not pay for itself. So the cost of bringing services to a new home is not entirely borne by the folks who live in that new home. The delta, the piece they can't cover, gets spread among all taxpayers. So in order for local governments to have enough money to do a basic job of meeting basic services, we need new growth, and yet new growth costs the taxpayers money.
Isn't that the situation we're in?
That is that's it, man. That is exactly it,
Dennis. We have
Dennis.
all these, between the city and the county, you've proved, I don't know what the running total is now, the number of new homes, new lots, new things to meet that. So we've got the growth, but then at the same time, it takes time for that to come online.
Well,
right?
When those houses are built and somebody's living in them, they come online. But we aren't facilitating growth in order to get more money. We're facilitating growth because we have a housing shortage and we have a worker shortage, and they're linked. People can't come here to work if they can't have a place to live. And in fact, the growth is, there's an irony to it. Yeah, it provides the revenue we need to remain doing our work, and it also costs taxpayers money, and we too are taxpayers, as are our families. It's, as Jordan has mentioned, it's a broken system. So two other pieces I want to mention. When you said fiscal responsibility, I'm gonna do a little bit on mythology and a little bit on reality.
Okay.
So first, the mythology. Some of Mr. Thane's colleagues, and not Mr. Thane, have said, local government, your spending is out of control.
Yeah.
And then they roll out these studies saying, oh, look at this. The spending in Missoula County went up by X percent. Look, they're insane. They're tearing it up. It's mythology because spending and taxation are not linked directly. It's not a one-to-one linkage. We do in the county quite a bit of large infrastructure projects. We can only do this because we access state and federal grants. The dollars are way too big to do locally. They're so big as we don't even think about doing them locally. We struggle to come up with the required match in order to get the federal grant. The one that the city and county recently did together was the Swatupcane or Build Grant area, $13 million. And city was really successful in just doing a $25 million, receiving a $25 million one recently. There's no way that $25 million could be borne on the backs of city residents. It's making the match. So anybody who's listening, if you see, oh, look, their spending went up 10%, they are killing us. All that money spent did not come from taxes. And in fact, as has been said, we exist under a mill cap. Our spending is capped. We have staff who are super skillful at getting state and federal and foundation grants in order to do the work that people expect. So please do not conflate spending and taxation. Spending goes up like this because we're good at getting money to do real work. Taxation goes at half the rate of inflation, the piece that we control. Now, there are things that are voted in. We have this gorgeous, globally award-winning library we're sitting in. We have an equally spectacular park headed that direction. Those were voted on, as are all kinds of things. That was the mythology. Spending and taxation, not the same thing. The reality, and Jordan said this really articulately, that a tax system should match the economy. It just makes common sense. Right? The tax system should match the economy. Last year, according to the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research, we had 3.5 million tourists in Missoula County. We have 120,000 residents. Why is this connected to taxes? Because when those 3.5 million folks are here, they're using services. And it's not like they're stealing. They're not bad people. We're glad they're here. They put money into the economy and generally well behaved, but they drive on our roads. They call 911. They interact with people who are smart and can look them in the eye and do math and are friendly and are products of our super excellent public school system. The people interacting with those folks benefit from that and yet do not pay for it. In the same way as they drive on our roads or call 911 or ride on our bike paths or visit our parks, or take advantage of any of the tons of amenities that have been created with tax dollars. Tourism is a major part of our economy. And our tax system should match our economy, and in this case, our tax system exists blind to the fact that we are providing services for people who don't pay for them.
That's what always gets scary.
Not
though,
right.
Because people look at our neighboring states, and they will look at it and say, okay, local option, tourism tax, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Gas taxes go up. I mean, you just have to look at some of the, populous states on the coast to see Washington and Oregon, classic case of that, though. So you still have to have some ways of sort of managing that, though.
Oh,
right?
for sure.
That same approach
yeah.
of fiscal responsibility.
I mean, I don't have a lot of power in this case. My friend Mr. Thane does. I would advocate for a targeted system. I don't think we should be taxing groceries and prescriptions and farm equipment and hardware and T-shirts, but we should tax hard the things that mostly tourists use. And I'm not saying we need to add that revenue to what government has. I'd just like to see a straight up one-to-one tax relief. Let's pay for the services you use, whether you pay for them through property taxes or you pay for them by adding more tax to your hotel room. And people may say, wait a minute, isn't there a bed tax? And how about that local option in whitefish? And I got to stop talking because other people need to talk. But those are things that need to be addressed, and they don't fit the model I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's been tough. Mark, I'm going to ask you, and then we'll switch over to our staffers for a minute, talk budget. But is Missoula unique? I mean, you take more of that state look. Are you hearing these same complaints from lawmakers in Billings and Bozeman and Malta for crying out loud? Are they running into this same kind of a crunch?
Missoula is not unique. And in fact, if you were to compare the overall tax burden of the Big Seven, Missoula actually falls toward the bottom of that list of 7 in terms of overall tax burden. So this is a problem that's somewhat universal. Quite honestly, rural Montana has experienced a lot of headache because they don't generate the amount of tourism They don't have the increase in tax base. They don't have the growth. And so they have increasing costs just like everybody else, but they don't have any option other than half the rate of inflation on their local property taxes. There are a couple things that haven't been mentioned. One that I think is really important, and that is in Missoula, 52% of the residents are renters. And I'll preface this comment by saying I don't think good ideas are the province of one party or the other, so I don't mean to be political. But one of the reasons the proposals that the Democrats put forth in the session were not successful was because there was a strong bias on the part of our party that we need to provide some of that property tax relief to renters. Because ultimately, if I'm a landlord, I'm going to calculate all my expenses, the mortgage, the property taxes, et cetera, when I set my rental rates. So if we give that break only to the property taxpayer, those who rent, who are actually paying that property tax to the landlord, don't benefit. So I think as we talk about restructuring our tax system, we need to consider how do we benefit renters too. And that was a real sticking point in the discussion at the legislature. I would also say, and I meant to mention it in my earlier comments, with regard to the 95 mills, that money previously went to the state general fund and then was reallocated to schools. One of the things we did this session is moved it to a special revenue account. It will take a year for it to kick in because collections will happen this November and next May, but then that money will be redistributed across the state. And the net effect should be that it should reduce the number of mills levied locally for things like the retirement fund, et cetera. So there will be some benefit. So while the tax rate wasn't adjusted, there was consideration for what do we do with this increased revenue that's generated by the 95 mills and how do we redistribute it effectively. So yes, it's a universal problem across the state of Montana. It's going to require some creative thinking and some real collective work on the part of both parties in order to affect some good legislation.
One quick follow-up too. I know we had a meeting here a week or so ago, a couple of weeks ago, where Department of Revenue was here, and they talked about this 50 to 60% number, and there was some feeling maybe some of those were overestimated. Is that some of the concern you're talking about this? You know, how is that formula actually used, and especially the information that people are getting on those tax letters and bills?
It's definitely overestimated, and I've never before been anxious to receive my tax bill, but I'm looking forward to the first week of November because I know that when I receive that actual notice, it'll be less than what was projected on my taxes. So my assessment fell right in about the average of Missoula County. It was about a 37% increase in the appraised value of my home. My taxes will not go up anywhere near 37%. The 3-year rate of inflation was 2.7%. So we experienced 9% inflation over the course of about the last 18 months. The cities, counties, and schools are relegated to only a 2.7% increase in those budgets. And that's going to be a real challenge because wages and materials, equipment, they've all escalated according to that inflation rate.
And I hear that from a lot of your former colleagues. I mean, school superintendents in particular, but also county officials in other counties, or Valley County, trying to hire people to fill these jobs and then come here in, you know, when the prices are up, when the home prices are up. It's a tangled web right now.
I serve on a board here in the community, and we are heavily recruiting, have extended a number of offers, and when people come to Missoula and see the price of housing, they oftentimes back out of the offers simply because they can't afford to live here for the wage that we can afford to pay.
Yeah. Let's talk about the numbers for a second. Get our number crunchers in, Chris Lonsbury and Dale Bickle. And gentlemen, maybe you can, Chris, talk about this from the county's perspective in the best layman's terms you can, about how that the property tax number and these caps and the mills and things we've been talking about, how does that inform when you're sitting down and you guys are working on the budget?
Sure, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to disagree with my good friend, Representative Thaman, and say Missoula is unique. Only because we're Missoula and we should be. You know, so from the county's perspective, and we are a little bit different than the city, that the county government is what we call a limited powers government, which means really we do what the state sets forth for us to do, and we have a really good partnership with our friends at the city, but we also have a good partnership with the state as well, but sometimes that messaging gets lost. So when we sit down and we look at the budget, we do exactly what Representative Thane was saying, which is we look at the services that we have to provide, those core services that are statutorily called out, the Sheriff's Department, the ability for us to, and I know no one loves this, to issue tax bills on behalf of those taxing jurisdictions. But we also, run state courts. Those are part of county functions. So the judges are state employees, but the facilities are all provided by the county. The same thing when it comes to sanitation and subdivision, right? Those are all statutory duties. And so we look at all of those things and we look at where are we having challenges recruiting, where are we having increasing costs, and then we go through and we do, on the county side, we set the base budget, which is how much will it cost us to do exactly the same things we did last year, assuming that we will do nothing new that folks have asked for, or even things that the state will now require us to do. What will that increase be? And that's where we spend a good portion of our time, really basically starting in early February, leading up into the summer. And then beyond that, then what we do is we go out to departments and we say, okay, now what were the new statutory requirements that you will have to comply with, and what will the cost look like for those statutory requirements? And then the last thing we ask departments is, what are new services you're hearing from constituents? So the county's, again, a little different than the city. We have 9 independently elected officials who are not county commissioners. So the county attorney, the sheriff, the superintendent of schools, justices of the peace, all of those folks who are elected. And they all hear from constituents in different ways than the commissioners hear from constituents. And so they also have needs and priorities that they hear from those groups. And those are the last thing that we look at, which are those new programs or new things that folks want to hear. We have great success with a lot of those new programs that folks might have heard about. In the county attorney's office, they have a very successful diversionary program, which is really critically important to the county because it keeps folks out of detention who really shouldn't be in detention. We have really great programs going on in our justice court around DUIs, which help to reduce repeat DUIs in Missoula County, which is, again, really good for public safety. And we have innovative things happening in our detention facility and in all of our departments. But we look at those new things as the very last thing. And then based on that, the commissioners sit down and they hear from all of those departments, those elected officials, and then they make really hard choices. They sit in rooms and literally agonize for hours over what are the things that we can do and what will that impact be to somebody's property taxes, because they are all property taxpayers. I'm a property taxpayer here in Missoula County. And we recognize how heavy that burden falls on folks, and I see that when working with them. And that all of those meetings are open to the public. I would encourage folks, they're up on our website. Budget meetings are ongoing right now. We'll do our heavy lift of budget stuff really starts in August. For us, it starts a little earlier for the city, and Dale will speak to that. But ours really happens in August, and that, again, goes back to my good friend, Representative Thane. The piece that's missing, as Representative Thane pointed out, is we don't know yet what the number of mills are that we can actually levy, and that doesn't come to us until the end of the first week of August.
And I've always thought, having covered news in other states, to me that is like one of the strangest things I've ever seen. That here you're expecting, because in a lot of jurisdictions, budgets don't really hit till year's end, right? When you've got all of this information, you know what the legislative priorities are, you know what the funding is or isn't going to be, you know what the tax bills are. And it's just weird to me that you guys have to kick into budget gear before you have a lot of that info.
Yeah, we do. And the piece, like I said, that Representative Thane was saying, and that's what creates that really large disconnect. And that really scary thing is you look at those mills from last year, and we know we can't levy that number of mills because of increasing values of homes. The number of mills that we can levy will automatically be driven down. And I know the state deals with, the deadline of DOR has to have these notices out by this certain point, and then counties and cities come along behind that by several months. And it really does create this information vacuum, which, creates this really scary feeling for people that we're seeing right now. And that might be something that cities and counties and the state could work on, is how do we close that information gap. So I want to give Dale a chance to talk to you.
And before you go, Dale, go ahead and pass the mic. I want to mention, if you're watching the stream on MCAT, and thanks to the MCAT team for being here, if you have any questions, you can call 546-7692, 546-7692. And here for our reporter friends, in just a couple of minutes, we'll hear from Dale, and then we're going to open it up and get to some questions. Commissioner Slotnick will have to leave here in a little bit, so we want to make sure we get to some Q&A so it's evenly distributed here. Dale, tell me a little bit about the city budget, and the follow-up little question fit in there as well. Chris talked about you know, the inflationary impacts and things we're seeing. We've talked about that. How much of that is informing the budget process for the city right now?
It's an overwhelming part, Dennis. Chris really described eloquently kind of the struggles we have, and I just want to reiterate one thing is that, you know, the mayor and council don't necessarily control the level of service. A lot of those are just required statutorily, and we have to do those things. And so those things are automatic. But, you know, we do control our level of service in a lot of core areas like police, fire, streets, and parks and those things, but everything else like permitting, the courts, our legal division, those are statutory. We have statutory levels of service that we have to have. And then the other big thing that we really struggle with is that for a number of reasons, the city and county are going into new lines of business that has never been a municipal responsibility. So right now, you've seen our conversations regarding housing costs and houselessness have dominated our conversations for the last couple of years. They've been new priorities in the city's strategic plan, and we are doing our best to try to address these big issues facing Missoula. Now, these are national issues. These are things that we see our cities struggling across the country with. And not only are we trying to maintain the level of service in our core services like police and fire, we're trying to get into an area to be able to help these crises that are happening that has never been our responsibility. And so that's something new. And so it's hard for me to call my colleague in the city of Billings and say, how are you dealing with this particular houselessness issue? Because it's new to them too. And so those are the things that we're struggling with and puts incredible pressure on our budget.
Good, thank you. Let's go ahead and jump to our questions, and we'll start with our members of the media. Anything you want to ask at this point? Okay, good. Then we'll jump to the public, and we'll kind of bounce back and forth and get a couple of. I think I can. I'll run and do. Here we go. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. So, any questions we have? Anybody wants to throw out a question at this point? Come over this way, and I'm going to get you on this camera right here. Okay, give us your name too, please. I'll hang on to this because I got to run
Right
with it.
side here?
I got to hang on to it and run. So
there
go
you
ahead. Go ahead.
So I got here a little bit late. Gwen Jones, City Council, and I love talking about property taxes and tax reform because it's a linchpin on so many things that we provide as services, and it's such a crucial topic. I got here a little bit late, so you might have covered this already, but did you talk about the burden shift onto residential taxes? But then Dick Barrett had a really interesting op-ed yesterday on another burden shift, basically with our escalating values here, how our escalating values compared to in our urban area compared to rural areas are causing a burden shift also. And I don't know if y'all read that. I can't speak to it well enough to articulate it, but it was yet another complexity because tax policy is so complex and has such impact and can easily have such unintended consequences. So I don't know if you wanted to talk about that burden shift also.
Thank you, Gwen. Appreciate it. Anybody want to tackle that one? That's an interesting one. We talked about that. Mark, that's kind of a state lie. Let's have you chime in on that one. Go ahead.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question, Gwen. There's definitely a shift, and I did read the guest editorial that Dick Barrett wrote. One of the things that happens, of course, if we keep the tax rate the same, is that a lot of business and industry doesn't increase at the same rate that the residential property tax burden increases. One caution, though, on centrally assessed properties like Northwestern Energy's holdings, if their tax burden increases, look at your monthly bill because you pay a specific line item to cover their taxes. So you can pay it on the tax bill on your residence, you can pay it on your power bill. That's part of the reason we need comprehensive property tax reform. It's so complicated. There are so many nuances associated with it. And the simple fact of the matter is it's regressive. It's not a fair taxation system. And Montana is one of the few states that relies simply on two legs of taxation, and that's the income tax and the property tax. And as I go knock on doors during campaign season, not a single person ever raised the issue of property tax, or excuse me, of income tax. They all want to talk about property tax. Yet, I think a failure of this legislative session was we, again, reduced the top marginal tax rate, we reduced the capital gains rate, but we didn't do anything long-term for property tax. So we continue to skew that system, and that's a disservice, I think, to the residents of the state of Montana.
Okay, any other questions out here? Okay, go ahead and stand up. Oh, Josh, go ahead.
I just wanted to, because
Yes,
I have to run, I just
please.
wanted to say thank you for coming, and please ask questions about county stuff. Chris is here. He's the person I ask. So you're in good hands. And I want to say thank you to you, Dennis, for you do such a great job with this. You're really kind of exemplary.
I want to thank you. I want to ask you one quick departing
Okay.
question. Can we survive the next 2 years before the legislature jumps in? Or is there going to be pressure from counties, Association of Counties, for a special session or some other means? Can we survive 2 years under this, the way it's set right now?
Well, I can only answer part of that. The second part, I'll look to around the special session. I'll look to you because that's out of my. We will survive because we're scrappy. We will figure it out. Does that mean maybe we have to cut some things we don't want to cut? Yeah, it could be. We'll get by, but it might not be pretty. And as the mayor said, no one ever asked for fewer services. And I would say we do an okay job, but we could do a lot better, but we don't have the resources. And the resources fall on the backs of taxpayers. It's a vexing riddle. So we'll get by. And on terms of a special session, I'll leave that to Mr. Thane. And I want to say thank you all for coming. And please any questions to Chris. And I'm open, as are Dave and Wanda, talking with anybody at any time. So send us a note. We'll have coffee. You can come see us. Where our doors are open, phones are on.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. We're going to let him go. He's got a prior commitment. So, Mark, what about that special session idea? It's hard to get this. I know our lawmakers, I don't know when the last time we had a special session was. It's really difficult to get people back.
I would agree. I think a special session is a long shot. I also would say that we had a large budget surplus, and it really was the result of three different factors, I believe. Number one, we had a lot of federal money that flowed into the state of Montana through the COVID relief programs, the ARPA money. Although that wasn't taxed as it came into the state, when it was spent on infrastructure projects and payroll protection, et cetera, it was taxed. That generated a lot of revenue for the state of Montana. We also saw significant gains in the stock market leading up to about 2020. And as people paid capital gains, or if they had significant increased value in homes or farms or ranches and sold them, and they paid capital gains, that contributed to our surplus. And then finally, something that people don't recognize, because you walk around the community, you see all these help wanted signs, but right now there are more people employed in the state of Montana than at any time in its history. So income tax withholdings are well up too. There's also been wage inflation. So as the wages inflate, we get more income tax withholding. So I would suggest that the income tax withholding piece will continue, but it'll be largely offset by the reduction in the top marginal tax rate and the reduction in the capital gains rate. One of the things that was a particular frustration for me during the session, I won't get into the particulars, but I had a bill that was designed to essentially take income tax revenue and use it as a buy down on property taxes and reduce the property tax burden. And it was defeated in committee, and the rationale that was given to me was, we don't want to commingle the income tax and the property tax money. Well, if we don't commingle it, how are we going to provide any property tax relief? We've got a little bit of resource extraction money, particularly coal money in eastern Montana. We've got property tax and we have income tax. And if we look at them in independent silos, we're not going to be able to spread the burden out differently.
Thank you. All right, let's go over here. Question. Stan, and please give me your name. Let's turn this way so folks can see you a little bit too. So.
Hi, my name is Jan Trikel. I've got 700 million questions, and some of them were for Josh. I was hoping to catch him before he left. First, I'd like to say thank you to Mark Thane. I know you had great English teachers at Sentinel, and they were, it was clear in your letter last week in the Missoulian. That's the most concise explanation of this kerfuffle that we're in that we've seen. A lot of people appreciated that. So first of all, federal money. We've gotten this federal money. So far, the great state of Montana sent $24 million back to the federal budget because they said we didn't need it. We have a lot of programs. Let's start with the elderly out in the rural areas. They needed that money. but our governor and his friends apparently didn't. We have $75 million sitting over in the education fund, state education fund, has not been dispersed. If it's not dispersed by September, we're going to lose that. It'll go back to the other states who will use it. We lost, and I've lost the figure in my head, they refused, I think it's 24, but I don't know, $1 million to feed the school children during this summer because Montana didn't need it. I'd like them to talk to some of the kids that are going without lunches right now. And finally, well, the other one, the lost funds to the elderly. We're taxing the elderly Montana people out of their homes. My parents are included in that. They're Missoulians. Our family are homesteaders. We've been here for generations. And if they didn't have us kids coming back to help them, they'd be out of their homes. And I think we need to look at that, at the taxation. And the final one, I've got more, but the final one I want to throw in here is Missoula County, Missoula City support of the homeless. We have 5, count them, 5 homeless operations in Missoula right now. I have no problem helping Montanans or Missoulians, but they don't check any residency requirement. Anyone shows up, they can be supported in Missoula. And there are other counties in Montana sending their people to us. We went down to Johnson Street, my church pastor and I, two winters ago, 70 people at Johnson Street. 2 had ties to Montana. 2, not even Missoula, just to Montana. You guys need to take a look at what you're doing with our tax dollars.
Thank you very much. I want to break that into a couple of questions. And let me get back over here with the microphone. Mayor, when we talk about, she talks about the heartbreak, essentially, that we deal with when we talk about, people losing their homes and those kind of things, certainly the burdens that the homeless have and, how you do that. Are there ways to sort of target how this money goes, or is it just basically when somebody is in this vicinity, services have to be rendered?
Well, I'll take the ability to pay first. I think that is a huge concern with our property tax system. And as I mentioned at the outset, the ability to pay is not linked to the property tax rate, and you see that a lot with aging residents who are on a fixed income. Maybe their home's paid off, and their property taxes have continued to increase. There are some state programs, and I think that the problem with those is that the eligibility is really narrow to folks that really are experiencing much deeper poverty than a lot of I'm sure a lot of the scenario that you describe, and a lot of our retirees who are on a fixed income experience.
Some of that, I'll interject too, some of that is just good old Montana pride too. People don't want to ask for the help. They want to make it on their own.
Yeah, and so there's the elderly homeowner tax credit that Representative Thane mentioned is a framework that we could use, that the state could use, where with some modifications. I think changing the income threshold so that it's eligible, so that more people are eligible for it, figuring out a way to make it available to renters, and just broadening the eligibility would be one way that we could address. And also, changing the age requirement, lowering that so that more people could access that. That would be a good property tax circuit breaker measure. You've got like the circuit breaker in your home, and you plug one too many appliances in, and it trips. It's the same concept where you have a little bit more burden than folks can take, and there's a circuit breaker that kicks in some other relief mechanism. So I think that's something that we need to look at. On the houseless services, we do a point-in-time survey with our homeless individuals, and we do that annually. And we have a program called our coordinated entry system. So when a homeless individual looks to access services, they go through an intake process, and all of the service providers throughout the community, whether it's the Poverello Center or the Hope Rescue Mission or any of the other service providers, utilize what's called a coordinated entry system. So they take everyone's information, they ask a series of questions. One of the questions that they do ask is where someone's last residential address was. And that is about 70% Montana. And so there is an acknowledgement that, a portion of people, their last residential address was not in Montana. What we see across the system and across people accessing services is that it's about 70% had a Montana residential address most recently. We don't see data that shows, we hear anecdotally that people come here for services. We don't see data that shows that that's a pervasive trend. And it's something that, it's something that the services are not an attractant. No one's coming here to live in a tent by the river. I mean, it's just not an attractive level of service. I mean, it's a tough life.
Want to pass to Mark? Okay, there we go. Which one do I need to use? Get straight. Mark, I want to ask you, part of her question was about, federal dollars having been returned when you don't use them, those kind of things. That kind of leans into that mingling of funds too, right? Each one of those, it's not like it's a big, checking account, right? A lot of those are specific, and if you don't spend them specifically, you can't do much with it, right?
That's true. And again, I don't want to make it a partisan discussion, but I think a lot of people that have a more conservative approach would say, regardless of the source, those are tax dollars. If they're coming from the federal government, they're tax dollars. I think you hit the nail on the head, though, when you said if Montana doesn't utilize them and they return them, then there's a reapplication process and other states will take that money. So the money will get utilized. It's appropriated at the federal level. So if we don't take advantage of it, some other state will. So if you look at the Hungry Kids program, and that's a very current example, the state administration said, it's an administrative burden, so we're not going to accept the federal funds. However, we did last summer, and it was not an overwhelming administrative burden. So we recognize that there are children of poverty. Again, I had the experience of serving in the school district for a number of years, and we had staggering numbers of students that qualified under the federal guidelines for meal assistance because they were below the federal poverty level. In Missoula, people don't have the perception, but at the time I was superintendent, it was 43% of our students fell under those guidelines. We also had a significant homeless student population, and again, it doesn't necessarily mean that these students were on the street, but their families were unhoused. They might have been living with relatives. They might have been in hotels. They might have been transitional. When we did a point-in-time study in the school district, at one point we had over 600 students out of 12,000 who were in family situations where they were unhoused in their own permanent housing. So again, a program like that is hugely beneficial, very necessary for the community. And again, I think a perfect example of where if we don't utilize the dollars, somebody else will.
I want to ask Chris or Dale to sort of bring this down to that local level too, because I know there's always this wrestling. We saw this coming out of the pandemic, like, oh, there's these money, there's ARPA funds, there's the things. How much of accounting as you build a budget is based around trying to figure out what tags are attached to what funds? And does that complicate things?
So that's a great question, and the answer is yes, it does complicate things. And so just using ARPA as an example, ARPA came out with really broad guidelines, but it had about 7 categories that the funding could be used in, and one of those was homeless services, right? And so the county took the approach of, okay, this is an area where we're, again, going to, at least in the short term, provide services. And to date, the county has 2 sources of funding that it has used towards homeless services. The vast majority of that has been out of ARPA. The county also has a small property tax fund that is called the Community Assistance Fund, and that really is not used for what I'll call traditional houseless services, but it is used to help provide medical services, help folks get IDs and other things when they're applying for assistance programs to help kind of bridge the gap for folks who are on the extreme edge of poverty. to be able to make sure that they can get through those. So at least on the county side, as we've worked in that area, again, there's always the argument of, well, even if it's federal money, it's still tax money, and that's true. But we have largely been able to use those funds in those areas that were specifically called for, and that has included assistance for Missoula Aging Services around meals. It's included assistance for supporting our neighbors who are homeless. It's also gone to assist some of our lowest income in the county side water and sewer districts in order to be able to have safe drinking water and sanitation for some of our poorest residents in areas like Clinton and Sealy Lake and other areas. So Dale, I don't know if you want to share about the cities.
Pass it, Dale. Well, and I can add one question to that that's kind of specific, because we had the crisis services levy that failed. So now you're building your first budget without that, without those funds that were not approved last fall. Add a little bit, too, on the challenges that may be presenting, talking about some of these programs and different things that we're facing.
Sure. So all of the city has actually closely partnered with the county on many of the programs that Chris mentioned, and we are again using our ARPA, America Rescue Plan dollars, and those are one-time dollars that we're patching together to do these things, and other important programs like the mobile support team, which is that crisis response based out of the Missoula Fire Department that the county is also a partner in. But I also just want to emphasize the level of revenue restrictions we have. The only general source of revenue we really have is our general fund. And that is the fund that has the property tax limitation that we've talked about a lot tonight. But one of the misconceptions out there is that we can actually appropriate money from utilities or any of these other grant sources or anything else just because our priorities change. And those are legal restrictions, and we can't do that. So any of the new programs or anything else that come up that we are trying to fund, or is special circumstances that we need to do, it is borne by that general fund, which is subject to that property tax limitation.
And that's true of state and federal monies. I mean, when a legislative body, whether it's in Helena or in D.C., when they approve something, there are a lot of fences built around how those funds are used to ensure accountability, I suppose. Any other questions we have in our audience? Yes, let me grab the mic here. And we'll stand and kind of halfway face this way. But go ahead and ask your question.
My name is Christopher Coldice. Kind of disappointed that Slotnick left. He's supposed to represent the people. Obviously, we're not as important as a poem reading.
Well, he had a prior commitment before this was even said. So
I represent Frenchtown.
Mm-hmm.
I am the reason why the mill levy did not pass in Frenchtown. I just want to let you gentlemen know that. There's plenty of money, just people don't know how to budget. I want to speak with Slotnick. He talks about taxes and property taxes, and there's plenty of things that he can do to affect our property tax. He voted for the gas tax, even though it's not on our property. We still get to pay it, and if you haven't checked gas prices lately, they're going up. So we are one of the highest in Montana. As for property tax, in his district, which is my district, Smurfett Stone can be taken care of. And so because of these issues, I, Christopher Coldice, am running 2024 against Slotnick, who's not here. He doesn't represent my district, and he sure doesn't represent a lot of Missoula County. So I am going to be taking his place, and that's all I have to say.
Okay, Chris.
And as you can see, his chair's gone.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I had a feeling we were leaning into that sort of announcement. I do want to ask something, though, about the gas tax, because my recollection was that was stopped, right, Mark? Let me get the mic to you, because as I recall, it was approved, we had it, but then it got shelved. Well, but let me finish.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's fine.
That's right. The community did vote for a local gas tax. It was an option that was afforded them by the state legislature a number of years ago, and Missoula County was the first county to actually take advantage of that. However, during the 2021 legislative session, the authority to levy that local gas tax was actually removed, so the gas tax was repealed.
I just want to clarify that, because that's an important point. That could be. Let me ask Mayor Hess about that, though, because I know there was a lot of anticipation that would give us some of these kinds of leeway and some of these kinds of options that we've talked about. Chris does bring up a good point, though, where, you start adding other pieces and taxes to that Lego puzzle, and it gets pretty complicated fast.
Yeah, and I think, my priority in diversifying tax sources is really that ability to replace property taxes. So the gas tax was voted on by the voters, and I think regardless of one's position on the gas tax, the thing that was problematic for me was that the voters approved it, and then the legislature took it away, and it was a different revenue source that could offset, that could pay for revenue that could offset property taxes. So it's that reliance on property taxes that's the problem in my mind. We've got a huge infrastructure deficit. We have about a $250 million deficit in our transportation infrastructure in deferred maintenance in the city of Missoula. And so you drive down a street with potholes or a street without curb and gutter, and we're underfunding that by millions of dollars a year. And it's a gap that we really can't fill without state or federal infrastructure funds or without a different revenue source.
And even if you get this is the thing I'm really fascinated by, to see what happens over the next couple of years, because the feds have opened the checkbook with the infrastructure funds. But in many cases, those projects are going to require some kind of a local match or some kind of a support or those kinds of things. And it seems like that's another thing that's sort of going to superheat that situation when we've already got a gap, right?
Yeah, one thing the legislature did do that was really positive was create a funding source for local governments, and particularly for smaller governments. A $50,000 match for Cut Bank, for example, or for a small community, could have a real impact on being able to bring federal infrastructure dollars to bear on a local transportation project. So I think, and Representative Thane could speak more to that funding source, I think, but being able to match those federal grants with state and local funds is a challenge, and so that was a big win that did come out of the legislative session.
Good. All right. Other questions? Let's get somebody else here, Chris. Let's go back here. Let's see if I can get back here. Okay. There you go.
Thank you. Hi. I wanted to go back to the property tax piece a minute. Representative, I assume you're familiar with the calculations, but I'm wondering, how much of the property tax increase is just a new reality with wealthy newcomers coming to the state and raising property values as well as inflation. But you also mentioned that the legislature didn't do the same fix that they had previously. So I guess my question is, how much of an impact would that fix have had, and how much of this is kind of a new normal just as the state grows and changes?
Okay, very good question. And that is interesting, because other states have certainly been where we are. You just got to look at, like say on the coast, you look at Colorado, they've had those kind of impacts too.
Thank you. Excellent question. I think there are a couple factors. Obviously, there's been an influx. There's growth in Missoula that's driven up home prices. That's reflected in the appraisals. I don't know the current figure, but I believe there's about a 1,200 home deficit in Missoula presently. So when there's a short supply, prices continue to escalate, and that is problematic. As we've heard previously, and it's true with the city, the county, and the school district, which are really the big three when you figure your property tax bill, they are limited to half the rate of inflation in terms of their general fund budget. So there will be some increase in those budgets, but again, fewer mills should be levied because you don't require as many mills to generate the level of revenue that they need to fund those budgets. That said, again, I think the common theme has been tonight, we really need to figure out a way to create a fair and equitable tax system. And that's going to require some significant change to property tax. Just one example, I had a constituent who reached out to me who quit a job out of state, moved home, moved in with an elderly parent in order to be a caregiver. The parent ultimately passed away. The child inherited the house, but now the child, who had, not a child, the adult, had given up good job, good income, now has a house, but can't afford to pay the property tax on the home. Those are the kinds of situations that I think reinforce for us that it's a broken system. And we need to diversify, we need to figure out a way to provide some significant and some real property tax relief.
Is there a way that we can tackle that issue, Mark? I know you're a pretty analytical guy in reporting, and can we use University of Montana? Can we use MSU? Are there some resources that we could really start to pull together the types of numbers that could sort of fuel this change?
Well, I think the Bureau of Business and Economic Research at the University of Montana does a great job with the data. Whether or not they do analyses of how taxes, work in other states is something that would be of interest to me. I think there are probably some models out there, but again, we've limited ourselves to two primary sources here in Montana. And you could talk about gas tax and bed tax and some of those other things, but in the grand scheme of things, those are relatively small pots of revenue. The two big ones are income tax and property tax, and to spread that burden to those two classes of individuals is problematic. Again, it was referenced earlier, we've seen this shift too from there are 14 different classifications for property in the state of Montana, and we've seen this shift from the other 13 really to the residential property tax. And we need to look at whether or not there needs to be a realignment of how the property tax burden is spread across those 14 classes.
Okay, let's throw it out here. Yes, go ahead and stand up, please.
My name is Siva, and I do have funny talk. And on purpose, I sit in front. If you have questions, if you don't understand anything, in the end, you can ask me. I came in this country 2002, 29th of December, 6 o'clock, end up in JFK. 3 days I have been without work. We do have very strong work ethic. We start to work. Kids, they have been at college and we move here. 2006, we bought house without anything for HOA or other little things because we end up without English,
Mic up so we can hear you.
without anything, and we didn't know nothing. We start to work. I do work in medical field in St. Patrick Hospital. It was time for one pay period. I put 184 hours. It was time I work 20 hours a day. My husband, he is truck driver. People are asking, how was your holiday? My holiday is when our father, when our grandfather is at home. That's our holiday. No holiday, no birthdays, no nothing. We have to work so hard. My question is, maybe someone of you is mad, you're good with math. I am not gonna talk the way how you talk, but I hope you're gonna understand my question. When I got this latest property tax assessment, I was thinking that I don't see well, even though I had glasses. And I took binocle to see. And I saw $1,300. I said, cannot be right. And I do pay currently $4,800 plus $1,300, $6,100. I do pay HOA $5,700. I do pay insurance $1,800, close to $14,000. Could you please make a math how I can put for these three expenses away $14,000? What are you gonna do?
Yeah, it's not
What
a full
about cell phone?
standalone home.
What about electricity? What about other expenses? How we gonna make it living? We're gonna build up beautiful bridges. And after all, we're gonna live under these bridges.
That's very, very good comments. Thank you. She raises, I think maybe this is one of the more interesting points, because when we talk about, and I'm going to give the mic to you, Mayor, to start, because this is a question. I mean, here's a hardworking medical professional, been working, buying her home, paying her expenses, her husband works. What do we do? How do you afford it? I mean, this gets back to that empathy question we were talking about early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thank you for sharing your story. And I think it illustrates a truly fundamentally broken system, as Representatives' constituents storied it well. And I think it really illustrates the need to have property tax relief measures, which we are not permitted to create at the local level, and to have different diversification of sources. It is, we continue to work on building housing in Missoula, and I think that's certainly part of the equation, is building housing that Missoulians can afford, building housing that will bring down the cost of housing through by providing more on the market, but also by providing housing that is targeted to folks that need it. So that's part of it. A huge part of this, though, is this system is unfair, and your story illustrates that. And so I think we have to remain diligent about working on this, and we have to share these stories more widely, and we have to come up with some solutions together in advance of the 2025 legislative session.
She used the word, and the way I phrased it was, it makes you mad, right? It gets you really upset when you come in. Yeah, you only have so much. Yeah. So the question I have for both of you, since you're the elected officials left with us tonight, are you mad about this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, this is us losing our soul as a state and as a community. If we can't get our hands around this, this is how. I mean, this will not lead to a good outcome if we can't get our hands around this as a state. I think we have some real inequities that continue to grow, and that we're really not dealing with appropriately. I was in Bozeman, and there's a shop in the downtown that had sterling silver Yellowstone branded belt buckles in the window, and clearly a tourism oriented good and a luxury oriented good, and you walk in there and you buy that without any kind of sales tax, and I think that's wrong. I think it is completely fundamentally wrong that you can have an economy that's based on luxury tourism, where that's a significant contributor to our economy, and that we don't have any kind of sales tax on those goods and services that are oriented toward those kinds of tourists. I think that's a gaping, glaring hole in the fairness of our system. So I think there's solutions out there. I think I think that until we can get our hands around them and start working on them, though, we're at risk of losing some things that are really precious to us in this state.
I'm going to pass the mic over because I'd like to get a staff perspective on this too. We hear from Jordan, he has to, what about either one of you? I mean, how upset your property taxpayers? What do you think when you sit down, Chris, and you're running the spreadsheets and you're crunching the numbers, and there's ladies and individuals like this in the community that are getting stuck between those spreadsheets?
Yeah, and I want to be clear. I think it's true for every person who sits at the table, right? I mean, like we are all looking at those numbers and saying they're astronomical, which is one of the reasons why, Representative Thame mentioned, and I echo the fact that we have a fundamental disconnect with the way reappraisal happens and the way that we then set budgets, and the fact that those two things paint this picture that is not realistic the way it's currently done. But like I said, I will say we, not just on the staff level, but on the elected official level also, sit down and agonize over those decisions for countless hours, because we recognize that those increases are not sustainable. And at the same time, we are stuck in exactly that same loop of having to buy goods and services in order to provide those fundamental statutorily required services at an increased cost.
Dale, you have a lot of friends that are connected with business and those kinds of things as well in the community. What are you hearing from them? I mean, we talk a lot about residential property tax, but I know it's not easy for a property owner that has a restaurant or other facility either, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it is not only do a lot of people facing the same thing, a lot of businesses do, and in fact, the city and county face those things. We in our increasing pressures, we are still trying to maintain our level of service to do that, and it's right. And I think Chris put it succinctly there, that what we are doing now isn't sustainable. The way the system is built, the way the service provision of the expectations of our public and our elected officials, we aren't on a sustainable path, and that's going to have to change. And tax reform is a solution to that.
I want to ask Mark. Well, go ahead and comment on that, Mark.
I would
a follow-up question for you.
Just a couple quick comments.
Yeah.
First of all, I think we need to channel the frustration that you express, and I mean that very literally. We saw over the course of the last 2 weeks the Department of Revenue do town hall meetings in 60 locations across the state because of the uproar that was created with the reappraisal notices. They got an earful, we got an earful. We just had our first organizational meeting of the Revenue Interim Committee of the state legislature. So we'll be meeting over the course of the next 2 years, and we decided that we would dedicate 35% of the staff time that we have available to us to study the property tax issue and possible solutions. But the reality is, when we get to the 2025 session, we're going to need to have engagement from the public. We need to hear what the public issues are, what their perceptions are, and what solutions they support. One of the difficulties, I think, is that the legislature is influenced by what they're hearing, and there hasn't been a collective call that's been coordinated in the past. I think this is an opportunity to coordinate that call because people have a common interest. They receive those appraisal notices, they look at property tax. Now's the time to have that coalesce into potential solutions.
I wanted to ask you, do you have any fear? I mean, obviously anybody that studies politics and taxes has heard of Proposition 13 in California. I mean, it was a case where people got it up to here and they took it into their own hands. We don't have exactly the same kind of mechanisms. But what would happen to us if there was that kind of citizen outpouring and they said, we're going to change this?
Well, I would first say that I think the limitation of half the rate of inflation was really a result of the kinds of actions that we saw with Prop 13 in California. It was the state of Montana recognizing that we need to do something to try and control that spending. Unfortunately, that was given to school districts, county governments, city governments, not necessarily to state government. I do think there's a possibility that there could be some kind of a citizen revolt. We could see, constitutional initiatives surfacing again, and that certainly carries weight. I would argue, however, that we had that last session. We had a potential in CI 101, and that should have been a wake-up call for the legislature in my mind, and yet we didn't come out with meaningful reform.
One other follow-up, somebody called in with a question too, and it has a very legitimate point. You know, Montana has kicked around the sales tax question, well, at least for 50 years. And the question is, what makes you think it will ever get done? How do we overcome that threshold? Of course, I will say Oregon had the same debate for eons, and then finally the money was needed.
I think it would be a very interesting discussion, and I think there's only one way it could ever get accomplished in the state of Montana, in my mind, and that is, number one, it has to be a dollar-for-dollar reduction on property tax. It can't be a new source of revenue. One of the things that I've heard discussion about is if we were to implement a statewide sales tax, maybe it needs to be something akin to the Alaska dividend program, where there's a rebate back to the citizens. So maybe they pay tax just as all the tourists do, but there needs to be a dividend back so that there's not a net negative impact on the local taxpayers. And I think there has to be, therefore, some kind of a dollar-for-dollar reduction on property tax. If there's any perception at all that it's a new source of revenue or an increase in people's tax liability, I think it would be problematic. I'll just throw one other thing out, though, and you can go online and do the research. Montana is one of, I think, 4 states that doesn't have a sales tax. If you were to look at overall tax burden ranking, Wallet Hub does an annual ranking, and Montana actually sits right now at 46th, which means only 4 states have less of a tax burden than Montana. Our problem is largely our tax burden is concentrated on property tax. So there needs to be some other diversification so that that's not the case.
Perfect. We're going to make one final call for questions here. Anybody else want to add? Chris, you had one other thought. Do you want to do it without running for office too far here, okay?
I just had a question for the mayor, or the interim mayor. Sure. And I know it wasn't under your watch, but the hotel there was bought and now it's been tore down and it's up for sale. Was that the goal of the city originally, was to spend tax dollars in doing that? When you're saying that transportation has a shortfall, is that the job of the city, is to buy an investment and sell it?
Are you referring to?
On the corner, the Sleepy Inn.
Oh, the Sleepy Inn. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Let me get the mic back to you here.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So the intent at the time was really to provide a non-congregate shelter for folks who needed it during the pandemic. It did serve that function. There were, I'm not going to recall the number off the top of my head. There were a number of individuals who used that during the pandemic, and it was compensated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So the city and county received essentially rent revenue for the use of the building for the shelter purpose. And then also, without doubt, saved lives by having folks stay in that space. After the pandemic progressed to a point where that was no longer needed, the decision was made that it was that building could be torn down and that lot sold for redevelopment. And so. At the end of the day, when this is all in, the city will have actually made money on that endeavor. That was not the intent at the time, but the city will have made money through the sale of the property and the rent received, the compensation received through FEMA for operating that. And then it's a redevelopment opportunity for some additional housing or other use. When the city sells property that is city-owned, that by city ordinance goes into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and so that'll provide additional opportunity then to invest in housing affordability.
I want to wrap up. We're just hitting our deadline here. But I do want to ask one thing, because we've danced around this question a little bit throughout the evening about, we mentioned the library, but we went through a period from, I want to say, 2014-15. We had the Project Division 2020 school levies. We had the library. We had the Fort Missoula Regional Park. We had those things. Is some of what we're seeing that bill coming due, or is it more of a statewide impact because it's not Missoula specific? And I'm just wondering about that, because we did go on there was quite the voters went on quite a spending spree, during that period of time.
Yeah, it's probably a combination. And I think there's some bond funds that will expire. Some of our open space bonds or other things that will come off the tax rolls. But one thing that I think is interesting is that you take this building and like I said, it passed about a 60-40 rate, and that is a demonstration of the community wanting a service. And I think that's something that shows that we need to find other ways to pay for the services that the residents want. When the majority of the residents ask for a service like this library or refreshed and expanded schools and modernized schools, that's an investment in the community, and it's an investment in our future, and that's an investment that the voters are asking for. The problem goes back to our tax system and the way that we ask people to fund those. If we could put a local option tourist-oriented sales tax on the ballot that would capture very targeted tourism-oriented
those Yellowstone belt buckles.
Those Yellowstone belt buckles. If we could capture and have a tourism-oriented tax on things like that to fund things that voters wanted, I think that our community would go for that. I mean, I think that that's the sort of question that we should be allowed to ask the voters, though. The problem now is that we don't, under state law, we don't have the ability to ask the voters if they want to do something, and that's where I think the problem lies.
Mark, representing Thame, closing comments. I've heard you say
Sure.
that it's a legislative body, and it represents a lot of different diversity to try to get things through. But I'm hearing you echo some of what we heard Mayor Hess and Commissioner Slotnick say.
Sure. You know, I'm a Missoula native, so I just want to reinforce something that I just heard the mayor say. I think there are very few people in the community that would argue with the fact that Missoula would like to see continued economic development. We want to have jobs to support the children that we raise in this community, allow them to stay in the community and have a meaningful and rewarding career. So I look at the refreshed schools, I look at this library, I look at the Fort Missoula Regional Park, and while some of us may disagree with the priority on spending dollars there, in my mind, those are all about the quality of life that makes Missoula the place that it is and makes people desire to live in this community. And so I think those are really economic drivers. And we saw that particularly pre-pandemic when we saw business and industry, particularly tech industry like CTG or Cognizant. We saw, I'm trying to think of the one that did all the classes, ClassPass,
Yes.
et cetera. They moved to this community. They brought their business to this community because what the community had to offer, and also because we have a well-educated community based on the school system and the university. So, yes, there are challenges that we face as a community. I don't think there are challenges that we can't bring the collective capacity to bear and solve. But it is going to take engagement of the people, because in isolation, we're not going to make decisions that always sit best with the people. So I encourage you to be involved, and I'm encouraged that people are here tonight. Hopefully the listening audience will be engaged, and we've got to get some solutions proposed. No way around it.
Great way to wrap up. We want to thank all of our panel for being here. County Commissioner Josh Slotnick, of course, Mayor Jordan Hess, who hosted us, and thank you for your staff for organizing all this. Thanks to Representative Mark Thane for being with us. Thanks for Chris Lonsbury from the county, and also Dale Bickle, our co-chief administrative officers over there at both organizations. Thanks for your expertise. And Jordan, any final comments about involvement and those kind of things?
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. We do this monthly, and there's a different topic every month, and we are always open to suggestions. So if there's something of interest, you're welcome to reach out or talk to us after the program. And it's always the fourth Wednesday of the month, and it's great to have a good crowd, and really appreciate everyone coming. I spent a lot of time trashing the legislature tonight, and I want to specifically thank Representative Thane for being a voice of a thoughtful voice of reason, and for coming tonight, and for really fighting a good fight over there for Missoula. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us. And don't forget, this will be streaming if you're seeing part of it, or you want somebody else to see it. It will be online on MCAT's YouTube channel when they get that uploaded. So thanks for joining us tonight. We appreciate it very much, and thanks for being with us on Wednesdays with the Mayor.